Our story begins in the year 1845. Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 8 years. It was the year in which Friedrich Engels had published his treatise on the lives of the working poor in England and the start of the Irish potato famine. William Sherwood, a 25-year-old sailor from Lincolnshire, was residing in London's East End. His seaman's ticket, dated the 16th of August of that year, describes him as being 5 feet 6 inches in height and with brown hair, a dark complexion and hazel eyes. He also had the image of a man tattooed on his right arm. The document offers tantalising information about his voyages. On the 22nd of November 1845, he set sail from London on a London-registered ship bound for the West Indies. He was at sea for almost 9 months, and his ship did not return to London until the 14th of August 1846. When his ship docked, he would have had to run the gauntlet of local people who lived off the sailors. This account, written by Montague Williams, paints a vivid picture of the Dockland community at the time. The inhabitants of Ratcliffe Highway lived upon the sailors. There were a great many lodging houses there, still more clothiers and outfitters, and any number of public houses and beer shops, nearly every one of which had a dancing saloon at the back of the bar. Jack came ashore with his pockets full of money, but they quickly emptied. He was ready enough to spend his pay, but there were other persons still more ready to despoil him of it. In those days, there were no government officials to board the vessels and arrange for safe dispatch of Jack's money, and Jack himself to his home. No sooner did a vessel reach her moorings than she was swarming with boarding-house touts, crimps, outfitters, runners, and other rapacious beasts of prey. Poor Jack was soon in the hands of Philistines. From the public houses in Ratcliffe Highway there constantly issued the sound of loud laughter, mingled with shouting and fearful imprecations. Far into night, the women and the drunken sailors danced and sang to the accompaniment of screeching fiddles. For the most part, the women wore white dresses and white shoes. If the sailors were not entirely fleeced inside the saloons, the process was completed by bullies and fighting men when they staggered out into the street. The poor fellows were frequently drugged and sometimes half murdered. Ratcliffe Highway is now simply known as the Highway, and very little of the original notorious thoroughfare survives. One of the few remaining buildings dating from the period is the Old Rose public house, although sadly this too has closed and faces an uncertain future. Over the following 2 years, William returned to sea on vessels plying the North Sea coastal coal trade. During one of his periods on dry land, he met a local woman by the name of Charlotte Tarrant. Charlotte was a parasol maker from Wapping and was the daughter of a former sailor. They were married on the 21st of February 1848 at Christchurch, Whatney Street. The church was destroyed during the Blitz, and the site is now occupied by a car park and part of the Whatney Street shopping centre. After the wedding, they moved into Charlotte's family house at 37 Broad Street, Wapping. The house was on the east side of the road and looked across to the huge sugar warehouse that formed part of the London docks. Before the docks were built in the 18th century, the infamous Captain Bligh lived here. Around the corner is a pub named Turner's Old Star. This also dates from the period and is named after the famous artist, who apparently led a bit of a double life. The story is that he used to call himself Admiral Puggy Booth, and he took a mistress who was a landlady of the pub. Legend has it that when she died, the pub was left to him. Charlotte became pregnant, and she gave birth to their first child, whom they named Sarah Elizabeth Sherwood, in the early months of 1849. Sarah was born in Saxelby, which suggests they travelled freely between London and Lincolnshire. Sarah's birth was followed by a son the following year. William Francis Sherwood, or Bill, was born on the 19th of December 1850 at 37 Broad Street. Bill was baptised on the 5th of January 1851 at St George's in the East. By the time of the census 3 months later, William had moved back to Lincolnshire with his parents and was working as an agricultural labourer. His wife Charlotte remained in London and was living with their children at 37 Broad Street. They shared the house with her father, John Tarrant, who was now working as a sailmaker, his wife, Sarah, and their 3 children, Sarah, Samuel and William. Also living in the house was a blacksmith, his wife and their 2 children. A grand total of 12 people living in very cramped conditions. Charlotte and the 2 other members of the household were working as parasol makers. William returned to London by the end of the year and was working in the docks. The following summer, another daughter was born. She was baptised with the name of Martha Warwick Sherwood on the 24th of October 1852 at St George's in the East. The following autumn, disaster struck the family. Bill's 4-year-old daughter Sarah died suddenly of cholera on the 18th of November 1853, and within days her younger sister Martha followed her. The overcrowded housing of the East End enabled infection to spread quickly, and there was little that could be done in those days, especially if you were poor. Both children were laid to rest at St George's Wesleyan Chapel burial ground. The chapel itself was situated immediately to the east of St George's Town Hall on Cable Street. The burial grounds now form part of St George's Gardens and are a place of peaceful contemplation away from the busy main roads. Their third daughter Ellen was born in the early months of 1854, and although her birth must have helped to ease their sense of loss, there must have been concern that disease could return. Other parts of the city had seen various epidemics. There had been outbreaks of cholera in South London the previous summer, and famously in the summer of 1854 there was a major outbreak in Soho. On the 3rd of April 1856, William and Charlotte had another son, whom they named John Moses Sherwood. Baby John was baptised at St George in the East on the 27th of April. At the time, the family had recently moved to 1 Princes Street following the death of Charlotte's father. 1 Princes Street was the address of the St George in the East workhouse. It was perhaps the poor conditions at the workhouse that led to another family tragedy, the death of baby John that summer. London in the mid-19th century was an extremely dirty and unhealthy place. 3 million people populated the city, and many houses still relied on cesspits, especially in the poorer districts. Effluent was often forced upwards after periods of sustained wet weather. In 1847, the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers decreed that all privy waste must be discharged into sewers. This seemed like a good idea, and many districts in London, particularly the wealthier ones, were connected to a network of sewers. The problem was that these sewers discharged directly into the Thames and its tributaries, and the rivers were overwhelmed by untreated sewage. In some districts, those same rivers were still used as a source of cleaning and drinking. Wildlife disappeared from the Thames, and the river died. The Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Disraeli, described the Thames as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. By the summer of 1858, the situation had become unbearable, and the windows of the Houses of Parliament had to be protected by curtains soaked in chlorine to keep out the smell. The situation became known as the Great Stink, and it finally prompted the Metropolitan Board of Works and their engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, to construct new sewers that diverted the effluent downriver to outfalls at Beckton and Crossness. On the 14th of July 1858, William's wife Charlotte gave birth to another baby daughter. She was baptised with the name Harriet at St Mary's, Cable Street, on the 15th of August 1858. At the time of the baptism, Bill and his family were living nearby at 31 James Place. James Place was situated between Cable Street and the railway line, and was bookended by Devonport Street in the west and Stepney Causeway in the east. It was a narrow street with just 7 feet separating the houses running along its southern side from a high brick wall on the northern side. It was reached by descending several steps down from the streets at each end, and was a dark, dank and unhealthy place. It was probably these conditions which contributed to the death of baby Harriet in the autumn that year. The situation for the casual dock labourer grew especially desperate in January 1861. London was in the grip of freezing winter weather, and the ships were unable to dock. There was no work, and many families went hungry. Many dock labourers were involved in bread riots and rampaged along Commercial Road, smashing windows and stealing food. According to the 1861 census, they were still living at 31 James Place, in spite of the awful conditions. William was a dock labourer, and Charlotte was still making parasols. Their surviving 2 children, Bill and Ellen, were both at school. Cholera returned to London in the summer of 1866. On the 25th of July, the Times reported, "In all London last week there were 346 deaths from cholera and 221 from diarrhoea. It was evident, therefore," he added, "that cholera was a fatal type was prevalent in London, and as far as his observations on it had gone, especially in the London hospital, where many cases had been treated, it was almost entirely among the poor, and the occupants of the worst classes of houses, where sanitary regulations had been neglected." Bill fell ill at the end of the month, and his symptoms were severe enough for him to be transferred to the London hospital in Whitechapel. The vomiting and diarrhoea would have resulted in chronic dehydration, and in spite of medical intervention, he died on the 31st of July. The cause of his death was certified as cholera. At the time, London was in the grip of the worst cholera outbreak since 1854.